You are not the only hero. If you remember the old advertisements for PSO, that's a phrase that might sound familiar. And it wasn't an exaggeration. Being able to play with people from around the world was an unthinkable concept when the game released. I mean, just listen to this guy talking about it.
The gaming population is the entire population of the world.
Okay, that was a little exaggerated, but you get the point. With the explosion on Ragal and the disappearance of everyone on Pioneer 1, it's up to you and 3 other hunters to find the truth. But is that all there is to it? Does every action done by the player canonically belong to one of these 4 hunters? I'm here to pitch the theory that actually it's not. There's very little solid proof of who the player characters really are, and that's done on purpose so it's easier to self-insert your own guy. But by using the information that does exist, supported by the dialogue and the story of the game, we can start to infer that even the heroes aren't the only heroes. So where do we even begin? Let's start with the biggest piece of in-game evidence we have, which are the 4 heroes. This is a group that's referenced in episode 2, referring to the 4 hunters that defeated Dark Falls in episode 1. Very little is known about who they are, but with this in mind, we can actually start to get an idea of what canonically happened. After seeing the explosion on Ragal and creating a character, you are then brought to the principal of Pioneer 2, Colin Tyrell. He asks you and 3 others to help find out what caused the explosion and to look for any survivors of Pioneer 1. And really, that makes much better sense than just sending a single person down to investigate the whole planet. So from here, the game begins and the 4 hunters follow the trail of Rico Tyrell, the principal's daughter. They go from the forests, to the caves, to the mines, and finally the ruins, taking on all sorts of feral creatures and mutated monsters on the way. And finally, upon defeating Dark Falls, the lives of everyone aboard Pioneer 1 are avenged. And there we go, simple as that. Or is it? In-game, it doesn't take too long to go through each level and eventually save the world, but canonically, it takes way longer than just an afternoon to do this. This is where I'd like to introduce the official timeline of events, which is included in the art bundle for episodes 3 and 4. We're gonna go back to this a few times over the course of the video, but let's just focus on episode 1 for now. According to the timeline, the first group of hunters were sent to Ragal in the year 3084, and Dark Falls was defeated the following year in 3085. So the entire journey of episode 1 is a vastly compressed 12-month-long investigation on Ragal. Keep that in mind here. Pioneer 2 just arrived, an explosion is seen, and not much information is being shared with the general population. 12 months is a long time for anyone to wait when they're basically just outside their brand new house. So while these 4 hunters were continuing their journey, the question is, what else was everyone else doing? This is where I'd like to introduce the idea of a second protagonist. You see, episode 1 is a story of 2 paths. The first is simply taking the teleporter to Ragal and going through each level. This represents the 4 heroes going on their 12-month journey. No other NPCs can be found on the surface because at this point you're the very first group to have clearance to be down there. But it makes sense that eventually others would be allowed on the surface after you. And we're talking all kinds here, like other hunters, scientists, and landlords. All this activity, which happens concurrently with the 4 heroes continuing their journey, ultimately results in the quests that show up in the Hunters Guild. But that first group of hunters, they're way too busy with their own work to take on these quests. And the principal is worried to death about his daughter, so there's no way he'd put that investigation on pause to look into rappy enthusiasts or marital disputes. So who ends up taking these quests? Someone else entirely. A novice who was given clearance to Ragal after the initial group started to clear the way. Someone that, for this theory, we can simply refer to as the Hunter. You see, when you're in a quest, Ragal looks a little different. Rico's audio logs aren't around because they've already been collected by the first group, and in their place are other characters that have also been given clearance to go onto the surface. Before we go too deep into this, the obvious problem is that, for us, the same character is used for both free roaming and quests. So just imagine it like this. When you're not in a quest, your character plays the role of one of the first hunters to be on Ragal. And when you are in a quest, the perspective changes to a different hunter, taking on jobs while the investigation is ongoing. So let's go into the story of the hunter themselves. The first quest in episode 1 is really the beginning of their journey. It involves the hunter being accompanied by an android named Karik who teaches them the basics of fighting Ragol's monsters, and following this quest, they start to take on a variety of jobs and really start to earn their living. Requests like undercover journalism, search and rescue, data recovery, and even looking for a lost pen pal. And along the way, the hunter meets a variety of people like Karik, Ash, Sue, Bernie, and Ellie. The last of which is actually brought up in the timeline, referring to the civilian who made a backup of the Callus AI system. It's worth noting that, of all the quests in the game, there's only one where you actually fight a boss. The dragon, Volopt, and obviously Dark Falls aren't faced by the hunter, but they do take down Derolet by themselves. And considering Derolet has regenerative properties, it makes sense that it would come back for round 2 after the 4 heroes beat it the first time. And that's about all there is to say about episode 1. With the help of the timeline and understanding the task at hand, it's safe to theorize the existence of 2 separate protagonists within the same player character. While the character in the main story defeats Dark Falls and becomes one of the 4 heroes, the other character becomes well known in their own right, taking on all sorts of quests for the Hunters Guild. So let's move over to episode 2, get an idea of the story, and try to establish an identity for the player character over there. Rather than reporting to Principal Tyrell again, in episode 2 we're introduced to Natasha Millerose of the Pioneer 2 lab. She makes reference to the strange happenings on Ragol, the existence of the ruins, and the nasty critters that lurk there, implying that our character has already experienced all that stuff. Then she goes into the main mission, which is finding the whereabouts of a legendary swordsman who was thought to be dead. The player character also has a personal operator working with them, who's none other than Ellie from episode 1. She gives us a nice to meet you and doesn't reference the last time we met her, but maybe that's just for the people who didn't play that one quest she was in. As the story progresses, the player character follows a trail of messages left by Floen and fights the many creatures on Galdeval Island. This eventually leads them to the laboratory deep under the ocean, where they learn the truth about Floen's fate, and at the very end, the player defeats the mutated form of Floen and finally puts his soul to rest. Considering the task at hand here, it makes the most sense that the protagonist of episode 2 is one of the 4 heroes, and most of the evidence leans toward that being the case so far. Not only did Ellie not recognize us at the start, in Floen's last message he says he's waiting for the savior of the Red Captive Child, referencing Rico. But there's actually a few problems with this. First, let's go back to the timeline. We already know episode 1 ends in the year 3085, but in that same year, episode 2 both starts and ends. So the events of episode 2 take place during the 4 heroes' journey, and it doesn't seem realistic to think the lab would just borrow one of these hunters for a bit to look for Floen. As for the second problem, it's one of the 2 quests that's in episode 2. When episode 2 first released, it didn't actually have any quests. All it consisted of were the new areas to explore and the new monsters to fight. But later on, 2 online-only quests for episode 2 were added, and one of them is playable in PSO+. That one is named Seat of the Heart and is offered by Ellie, the operator that we first met in episode 1. In the description, she references how she's already worked with you as an operator, linking the player character of this quest to episode 2's story. But more importantly, several parts of the quest change depending on what quests you did in episode 1. If you followed the right quest line, you'll meet 2 familiar faces, Sue and Karik, once again. And guess what? They recognize you. Sue talks about your penchant for getting involved in things you shouldn't, like what happens in episode 1, and Karik wants to see how much stronger you've gotten since you first met, in episode 1. If it weren't for this quest, I'd have doubts on who episode 2's protagonist is, but the answer is much more clear now. The character who was picked by the lab to find Floen, and eventually defeated Olga Flo by themselves, is the Hunter from episode 1. With this in mind, let's put this all together in a single coherent story. After making a name for themselves as a dependable hunter, this character was then contacted privately by the Pioneer 2 lab. The lab's director then requests this hunter to take the lead on an investigation on Galdeval Island. After taking a virtual exam to prove themselves, the lab allows this hunter to then be dispatched to the island and assigns them an operator, a woman whom this hunter had previously helped. So with the operator's help, the hunter is able to locate the abandoned underwater laboratory, discover the fate of this swordsman, and use all of the experience they've acquired to lay his soul to rest. This hunter sounds pretty damn cool if you ask me. Episode 2's story is a lot more compact, with only the main story and a single quest. Before we move on though, what about that last message from Floen, the one explicitly referencing the savior of Rico Tyrell? There are a couple possible explanations here. The first, and least realistic, is that this is just a video game. It's supposed to be played after episode 1 and after beating Dark Falls, and this line could just be a way for the player to feel connected to both stories. As for the other explanation, let's look at these words more closely. I wait for the savior of the red captive child. The timeline doesn't say whether Dark Falls or Olga Flo is defeated first, so it's up in the air if Rico was actually saved at this point. But Floen refers to her as the captive child, not the child who was already saved. So maybe in this case, Floen's last request is simply, I hope whoever saves Rico is also able to save me. I'm also reading too deep into a single line of dialogue. Let's just move on to the next episode. And thankfully, things are a lot more simple this time in episode 4. Once again, Tyrell asks for the help of the main character to investigate some fishy business involving a meteor hitting Ragall and the military acting a little weird. So which hunter was asked to look into this? The events of episode 4 happen a year after 1 and 2 are wrapped up, so at first it could be anyone's guess. But the answer lies in the very first quest, where we come across Sue and Karik, and both of them recognize us. Then in the following quest, we meet Bernie and Ash, and the former directly mentions a quest that we took in episode 1, so that very easily figures things out for us. The hunter, originally taking quests in episode 1, then leading an investigation in episode 2, has now been directly summoned by the principal of Pioneer 2 to provide assistance. Talk about advancing through the company. Sure, the hunter didn't take out Dark Falls, but they're no slouch either. Episode 4 ends with them defeating a giant sandworm, so their kill count is starting to stack up against the 4 heroes. You might be thinking, well, episode 4 has a free roam mode just like episode 1. Wouldn't that imply the existence of multiple characters once again? And to that I say, the free roam mode of episode 4 is basically not canon. The only quests in this episode are the ones that go through the actual story, so it's safe to assume that canonically, everything happens across these 8 quests rather than in free roam. But who knows, maybe before anyone else got to the crater, some mystery Chad just carved a path through everything and took out that sandworm first. Normally this is where we would transition to episode 3, but it takes place around 20 years later in the timeline. In the meantime, a couple things happen that are worth bringing up. The first is a reveal that's actually made at the very end of episode 3 and is literally only mentioned during that scene. When the 4 heroes first slayed Dark Falls, it wasn't fully defeated. Falls would then start to regenerate itself and would need to be fought again, using more power and becoming stronger with each revival. It's not known just how many times Falls had to be defeated, but this was a way for the game to canonize the 4 levels of difficulty, so let's just say he revived 3 times. Eventually, it was becoming clear that Falls would become strong enough to completely wipe out Ragall and Pioneer 2. So, and work with me here because I'm just reading the script. The spirits of Rico and Floen combined their mental strength while Falls was attempting one last revival. The sheer amount of energy in a single spot resulted in an overwhelming force that caused Falls to be defeated once and for all. A couple things were left behind as a result, but that's not what's important right now. What is important is the 4 heroes were keeping themselves plenty busy while the hunter was going about their own business. So with that taken care of, let's talk about the other event that happened in the meantime. We already went over the first quest that was added to episode 2, but the second one is a little special. It's called Blue Star Memories, and upon starting it, we learn that it takes place 10 years after fighting Dark Falls. We meet a hunter named Neff Miyama and his 2 students, Break and Orland. Neff wants us to join his students through a VR exam to prove their abilities as hunters. So off we go. Halfway through the quest, both students take a break to talk about a certain group of hunters that defeated Dark Falls. That's right, we're back to the 4 heroes. Though it sounds like their story hasn't been widely circulated throughout Pioneer 2. I guess it makes sense to keep the citizens in the dark about how there was a god of destruction hiding on Ragall. By the sounds of it, the 4 heroes are really only known to a select group, such as the master of these 2 students. Anyways, going to the very end of the quest, Neff makes the grand reveal to his students that you, the player, are actually one of the 4 heroes, so our character from episode 1 does end up getting another shot in the spotlight after all. It's a little funny to imagine the 2 quests in episode 2 are played through the perspective of separate characters, but a lot of this is just crazy theory nonsense anyways. And now we make it to the end of the road with episode 3, the last one in the series. Taking place 20 years after episode 1, it's reasonable to finally add a third protagonist to this list. This one we can refer to as the Commander. Rather than working as a hunter themselves, the Commander, true to their name, strategically commands the hunters that work for them. Par for the course, we don't know much about the Commander's true identity, but we meet a few characters from Blue Star Memories, like Neff, Break, and Orland, and none of them recognize you. So at the very least, the Commander doesn't appear to be one of the 4 heroes. Another thing worth mentioning is how episode 3 has 2 different storylines, either working for or against the government. The same major events happen under both storylines, so there doesn't appear to be a canon faction that the Commander works with. And that's really it here. Since they aren't a hunter themselves, the Commander doesn't get down and dirty with the events that happen in episode 3, so they don't hold an impressive kill count like the 4 heroes or the hunter, but their true accomplishment comes at the very end of episode 3. I'm talking end of credits. A major part of the story is finally making Ragol a safe planet to live on, since everyone has been in orbit for the last 2 decades, and with the Commander at the helm directing their hunters, the last remnants of Dark Falls are finally defeated. With that, Pioneer 2 is finally able to land on Ragol. There is one last thing I want to bring up in episode 3. On the hunter side of the story, you operate in the Card Laboratory and report to Chief Pentaglass. Early on, after the Commander proves themselves as a valuable asset, Pentaglass makes a certain passing comment about your work. He says, quote, "Natasha herself complimented me earlier." Natasha, from Pioneer 2's lab, who the hunter worked with in episode 2. The Commander, now working in a lab themselves in both storylines. Did the protagonist of episode 2, after being recognized by Principal Tyrell, begin working directly for the government and be the player character for episode 3? Okay, I think I've gone beyond full headcanon into full fanfiction at this point, so I'm just gonna cut myself off here. I'll fully admit I looked way too deep into things. After all, the only character with a confirmed named existence is one of the 4 heroes, and that's only in a single quest. Still, with all the different characters and storylines we see in Phantasy Star Online, along with an official timeline, I'd like to think that behind all these events are people that will be remembered, either as a hero who defeated Dark Falls, a hunter whose accomplishments raised them through the ranks, or a commander who ended the 20-year stasis in Ragol's orbit. Maybe these are separate characters, or maybe it's just a single hunter that rose to the occasion. But no matter what the case is, one thing stays the same. Throughout each episode, we met and fought alongside all sorts of other hunters, each on their own journey. Be it the 3 other heroes that defeated Dark Falls, or one of the many NPCs in the single-player story. I guess the tagline of the game really does make sense. After all, we aren't the only hero. Blue Star Memories is a pretty interesting quest, isn't it? It takes place 10 years later and you play as the same character that defeated Dark Falls. And there's also a bunch of characters hanging out like, oh, this person. Oh, she appears to recognize us. Oh, it's Martha Grave, from a quest in episode 1, who explicitly wasn't helped by one of the 4 heroes. Ah, for fuck!